Please stand for the singing of Living Gratefully on page 85 of your white Gotha book. Difficult is it to receive a human form. Now we are living it. Difficult is it to hear the Dharma of the Buddha. Now we hear it. If we do not cross over to the truth in the present life, in what life shall we cross over? Let us with sincerity and true reverence take refuge in the three treasures of the truth. I take refuge in the Buddha. May we together with all sentient beings awaken to the great way of enlightenment and to the unsurpassed intent of Amida Buddha. I take refuge in the Dharma. May we, together with all sentient beings, enter the storehouse of the Dharma, becoming like the wisdom ocean. I take refuge in the Sangha. May we, together with all sentient beings, become units in true accord, in harmony with all things. The peerless, profound, and wondrous Dharma is rare to encounter, even in many hundreds and thousands of kalpas. Now we are privileged to hear and receive it. Let us thoroughly understand the true meaning of the Tathagata's teaching. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namandab, namandab, namandab. Please be seated. Today's Dharma message will be given by Minister's Assistant Leonora Clark.
Please join me in Gasho. This body that ordinary people cling to is so fragile. With full attention, completely aware, I will throw this body down. Because of the pain of things, I love to be watchful. I have finished with craving. The Buddha's teaching has been done. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanda, Namanda. Good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning. We're functioning on what you might call a skeletal crew at the Betsuin. In terms of ministerial staff, it's just myself, Emmy, and Trevor, and I'm very glad that they showed up this morning. The rest of our ministers and MAs are at the World Buddhist Women's Convention down in San Francisco. Perhaps because I was worried about flying solo, I struggled even more than usual to get something down on paper for my Dharma talk today. Procrastination is a deadly enemy, as I'm sure you all know, and the bulk of my free time lately has been spent binging on television shows. I barely seem to have time to press the stop button before the next one starts. So finally, on Friday night, I forced my mind to focus and realized that the obvious topic for us today, since none of us are able to attend the World Buddhist Women's Convention, is to talk about the role of women in Buddhism. This can be a tricky topic because historically, although women have always practiced Buddhism, with a few notable exceptions, there's very little evidence of them as teachers of Buddhism. Their voices are frustratingly silent when you look through our textual record. But instead of dwelling on their absence today, I want to focus on one of those notable exceptions. If this discussion piques your interest, I want to let you know that all of the materials that I'll cover today can be found in one of my favorite books. It's by Susan Murcott, and it's called First Buddhist Women, Poems and Stories of Awakening. And I just ordered a copy for our new library, so it'll be on the shelves soon, and you'll be able to check it out, and I hope that you'll be inspired to read it. So Murcott's book tells the story of the very first community of Buddhist nuns. This female Sangha was formed a long, long time ago during Shakyamuni Buddha's lifetime. Unlike most of the women that we read about in Buddhist texts, which were written by men, this is a very rare instance when we are actually able to hear women's voices telling their own stories. For these women recorded their thoughts and feelings in the form of verses and poetry. These poems have been preserved over the centuries, first orally and then written down in the 1st century BC. They were ultimately incorporated into the Pali Canon. The text that contains them is called the Therigatha, and the whole collection contains 73 poems. Therigatha is translated as Songs of Women Elders. The poem that I read at the start of this talk is found in this collection. I really can't overstate how fortunate we are to have this record of Buddhist women's voices from ancient history. But our luck doesn't stop there. In the 5th century, a monk named Dhammapala of Kanchipuram decided to write a commentary on the Therigatha. And in that commentary, he included a brief biography of each woman as a preface to their poem. So not only do we have the beautiful and stirring words of these first nuns, we also know a little bit about what their lives were like and what first drew them to the Sangha. In her book, Susan Murcott interweaves these stories with a little bit of history from the time. She tells the story of the Buddha's path to enlightenment from the perspective of the women in his life. We all know that he went off into the forest at the age of 29, and that he left not only his wife Yasodhara and their son Ruhala, but also many other wives behind him. Before I read this book, I never thought to ask, well, what happened to them? Well, it turns out that when he returned 7 years later, many of these former wives were deeply influenced by his new teaching and decided to become nuns. Even his adoptive mother was inspired by his experience of awakening. This group of women formed the core of the first women's Sangha. They were soon joined by others for a couple of historical reasons. Firstly, as we know, the Buddha was a great teacher, and he converted many men to join his monastic community. This left their wives, like Yasodhara, to fend for themselves. Many of them were inspired by this newfound freedom to abandon their householder existence and seek the truth. The final subset of women that Murcutt talks about, whose circumstances contributed to the formation of the first Sangha of nuns, was a group of widows whose husbands were killed in a battle over water rights. After the fighting had ceased, the Buddha preached a message of peace and compassion, and the distraught women or widows standing by were influenced by his words, and they in turn sought a place to practice these new teachings. Unfortunately, these women were at a disadvantage because whereas their husbands had a monastic community that they could join, there was no sanctioned Sangha for women at that time. Murcutt goes on to tell the story of how this problem was resolved. It was actually the Buddha's adoptive mother, Mahapajapati, who led the movement to start a Sangha for women. Mahapajapati was very much moved by the story, as I said, of her son's enlightenment, and she wanted to become a nun and devote her life to the study of the Dharma. She asked Shakyamuni, her son, 3 times for permission to form a women's Sangha, and each time he refused. Finally, she gathered all her fellow women seekers with her, and they marched many, many miles to where the Buddha was staying. He refused to see her, even though she was exhausted and covered with dust from the traveling. But Ananda, one of his main disciples, spoke with her. She told him what she wanted, and Ananda brought her request to the Buddha. However, again he refused. Finally, on the 3rd time that Ananda asked him, he gave a conditional consent. They could form a Sangha, but only if they would accept 8 additional rules that would apply only to Buddhist nuns. These rules basically decree that nuns must always remain subservient to monks, no matter how advanced their practice is. This concession has led to many future problems throughout history, but we must not forget that for that time period, these women actually won quite a victory and had quite a bit of autonomy. They had the opportunity to study and practice at a high level, which was unheard of at that time, particularly for women of the lower classes. Additionally, this gave them the opportunity to become teachers themselves, if not for men, at least for their fellow women. The poems of the Therigatha attest to the depth of their knowledge and their understanding of the Buddha Dharma. I'd like to read a couple of their poems now. I'll start with a poem written by a woman named Vijaya, who became a nun along with her friend Kima. Vijaya tells us in the poem how she was moved by the words of her friend. 4 or 5 times I left my cell. I had no peace of mind. I went to a nun and respectfully asked her questions. She taught me the Dharma, earth, water, fire, and air, the nature of perception, the 4 noble truths, the faculties, the powers, the 7 qualities of enlightenment, and the 8-fold way to the highest goal. When I heard her words, I followed her advice. In the first watch of the night, I remembered that I had been born before. In the middle watch of the night, the eye of heaven became clear. In the last watch of the night, I tore apart the great dark. Then I lived with joy and happiness filling my whole body, and after 7 days, I stretched out my feet, having torn apart the great dark. The second poem that I'll read is written by a woman named Siha. She was the niece of a famous general who converted to Buddhism. When she heard Shakyamuni preach one day, she decided to enter the nuns' order. For the next 7 years, she followed the Buddhist path, but was unable to attain enlightenment. Finally, in despair, she decided to kill herself. So she went to the forest with a rope, but before she went through with it, she had a deeply religious experience. Here is her poem. Obsessed by sensuality, I never got to the origin, but was agitated, my mind beyond control. I dreamed of great happiness. I was passionate, but had no peace. Pale and thin, I wandered 7 years, unhappy day and night. Then I took a rope into the forest and thought, I'd rather hang than go back to that narrow life. I tied a strong noose to the branch of a tree and put it round my neck. Just then, my heart was set free. So these are just a few of the poems for the book. Truly, I could go on all day. I find these poems so beautiful and poignant, and they seem to come straight from the heart. I hope that if you have a chance, you get a chance to check out the book. It'll have a different cover. The one that I ordered was a used copy. But I hope these poems have inspired you to take a look at it. And just a brief note before I close about the new library. It's pretty much done now. I think we'll probably have a grand opening next week after the Gomon Shu's visit, and maybe to coincide with the Dharma school starting. And I think we'll figure out some system to check out the books where you can just put down your name and what book you've checked out. It might be for members only, I'm not sure, who are able to check out, but the resource will be open for everybody. So just want to thank you again for listening to my talk. Please join me in Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namanta, namanta.
Thank you, Minister's Assistant Clark. Everyone has, I think, a copy of the pledge. If you would stand and we can recite it together. Breaking out of my shell, I will share a warm smile and speak gentle words, just like the kind Buddha. Not becoming lost in my greed, anger, and ignorance, I shall think and act with an open mind, just like the calm and peaceful Buddha. Not putting myself first, I will share in the joy and sadness of others, just like the compassionate Buddha. Realizing the gift of life I have received, I shall strive to live each day to its fullest, like the Buddha who worked tirelessly to liberate all. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Please remain standing for the Gatha on Doksan 1, found on page 106 of your Gatha book. This concludes the live streaming of our service today. To those of you who have joined us online, thank you. We hope you will join us again and have a good day.